So we're going to talk about the revenue projections for a franchise. However, before we do that, I want to cover some things from a compliance standpoint in reference to disclosures. I think it's safe to say that everybody knows that projections are just that, projections. As you might assume, we cannot guarantee performance, as that is really left up to you. We will provide you with the best help we can, but your success or lack of success is in your hands. It will amount to hard work as well as relationships that you have. Your numbers will depend on a number of things, such as what type of franchise do you have? Do you have a standard franchise with 20 host sites? Maybe a onesie host site with one host site, or maybe 50 host sites or 5? Your revenue projections will also be based on the type of equipment that you install. Is it a standard single portrait, where your estimated cost will run somewhere between $650 and $800? Or is it a media wall where you have 3 TVs and your cost estimates will run somewhere between $1,800 and $2,500? Or is it the landscape version, where your estimated cost will run somewhere between $245 if you're using the existing TV at the host site to over $1,400? And then, of course, how much equipment is being used at each host site? Is it 1 screen or 3 screens or 5 screens? And on top of that, you'll have installation costs. Is it an easy install, or is it more involved where you have to run new electric lines to the new TV? And then, are you setting things up yourself, or are you going to use outside salespeople? And if so, how much do you pay them? So with all that in mind, let's dive into some numbers. And again, as a reminder, these are just projections. So let's start out with our standard 20 host site franchise. And in this case, we're going to assume they're all single portrait screens. We're going to further assume that there's no outside salespeople that you're going to use. And for revenue projection purposes, we're going to assume that there's 47 advertisers. So let's look at the numbers. As you can see with the arrows, we have the $27,500 franchise fee noted, as well as $1,500 set aside for what it might cost you in training to fly out and stay in a hotel. So we're going to assume 20 single screens, where we're averaging about $657 per host site. This puts the total investment at a little over $42,000 when we add in the franchise fee, the training, as well as the equipment. In projecting out the revenue, we're going to assume an average of $385 per ad. Now remember, our typical advertising slot runs over $500 a month, which would typically involve 120,000 viewers, although some metropolitan areas will command a higher fee while others will be lower. In using the $385 number, I effectively took the $510, applied a 25% discount to get to our $385 number. I would encourage you to go in and listen to our module called Print Ad Comparisons, as it will give you a pretty good idea of what a lot of the competitors are charging out there. So with 47 advertisers on board, that would give you a little over $217,000 of annual income. If we subtract out the 27% service, royalty, and national advertising fee, that would give you a debit of just under $59,000 for the year. Let's also come in and subtract out the server, life plan, and accounting fees that we noted over here. That's made up of the $12 monthly fee that's paid to the software company for the server, as well as the estimated life plan and accounting fees that I've added in as well. Now, sometimes the question comes up as to why we don't include the monthly fee for the media player in our overall service fee. And the answer is really quite simple. We have no control over your performance. So we could have a situation where you've actually installed equipment at a host site, yet there's no ad sales. And therefore, Media 360 would be responsible for the $12 per server times 20 host sites, or more if you have media walls, no ad revenue coming in. So the simplest way for us to deal with that is to have that responsibility be yours. You're the one that ultimately controls advertising sales. So the incentive will fall on your shoulders to get out there and get advertising sales done so that you're at least covering some of these minimal monthly fees. So that's going to turn out to be a little over a $4,100 debit each year. In this case, we're not using any outside sales representatives, so that's going to be 0 in that column. And then, of course, there's the 10% host site revenue share that you have that will be subtracted off the gross revenue number as well, leaving you with just under $133,000 a year of annual income. A lot of times we're asked for the estimate on return on investment, so I've added that number as well. In this case, that's 3.15 times a year. Saying that a different way, that means based on your investment of $42,140 and your net revenue of $132,679, you've had your investment returned back to you 3.15 times a year. Now again, let me remind you, this is a projection. Let's make just one change. Let's assume that you only have 19 advertisers instead of the 47 that we estimated in the last one. That brings your gross revenue to a little bit under $88,000 a year. And after all the fees, that would net you a little over $51,000 a year, for an ROI of 1.21 times a year. Let's jump in the other direction. Let's assume you have 135 advertisers a year, which is close to maximum capacity. That would give you gross revenues just under $625,000, or net revenue of $388,000 a year. Let's change the model again. Let's go back with our 47 projected advertisers and assume in this case that you're using outside salespeople for 100% of all of your sales. We're going to assume a 15% base rate plus a 5% first-year bonus, as well as a 5% sales team manager override, as well as a 7.5% admin fee. Now, quite frankly, I think this is well on the high side, but I think for illustrative purposes, it makes the point that you could have this thing packed pretty heavily with commission fees. It also assumes on the host site revenue share that there's an additional 5% that goes out to the sales team, which is on top of the 10% that you're already paying out to your host sites for the revenue share. That brings those debits at $70,000 and $32,000, bringing your net revenue to just over $51,000, or a 1.14 ROI. Let's change the estimation again and look at a mixture of singles and media walls, and again assume no outside assistance. You're doing it yourself, and 47 advertisers. By the way, the reason I pulled 47 as an example is that with our two competitors, Solera 360 as well as Active Digital, that both those companies are in that 40 to 50 average advertiser for their more established franchisees that have been around for a year or two. We divided that up with 13 singles and 7 media walls, which brought the total for equipment just under $22,000, or averaging just under $1,100 per host site. And as you can see, if you add in the franchise fee and the training, you come up with just under $51,000 for the total investment in this franchise. Because of all the additional monthly viewers, I've estimated the average revenue per advertiser at $510, giving you a total of just under $288,000 a year. After you take out all the deficits, that leaves you with just a little over $176,000 a year, or an ROI of 3.47 a year. Let's use the same model again, except that we're going to bring that down to 19 advertisers, with everything else being the same. Total gross revenue is just over $116,000. And after all the debits, that brings the net revenue to just over $68,000, or an ROI of 1.34 a year. If we make one more change, taking the total advertisers up to 65, our gross revenue is now just a little bit over $397,000, and the net revenue just under $250,000. If we make one more change, taking our total advertisers up to 135, that now places our gross revenue at a little over $826,000 or our net revenue at a little over $515,000 a year. Although many of our franchisees are the standard 20 host sites, we will have a number of onesie franchises where we have just one host site. So let's look at one where we have a media wall involved. Again, we're going to assume no outside assistance, that you're doing it yourself, and we're going to assume an average of 47 advertisers. Now the franchise fee is $6,500. We're going to assume that the training is a little less, so I've made that $500. And as you can see next, we have just one media wall that's averaging $1,889 for equipment, etc. That makes your total investment just under $8,900. For this one host site, we're going to assume that the average monthly ad cost is $25 per advertiser. I'm not sure that's untypical because each one of your signature type host sites is going to have somewhere between 7,500 and 10,000 viewers each month. So $25 a month would actually be underpriced, especially when you consider it being such a minor expense for each of the advertisers. That makes the gross revenue just a little over $14,000 or the net revenue just under $7,400 with an ROI of 83% every year. If we make one minor change and assume that we have a single portrait instead of a media wall, that brings the cost of equipment down to $657, thereby reducing the all-in investment to just under $7,700. I reduced the average monthly cost for the ad to $20. And when you assume 47 advertisers, that brings the gross to just a little over $11,200. Or net revenue just a little over $5,700 for an ROI of 75% a year. On the next example, I'm going to assume that rather than a single onesie, that you actually did a 5Z. In other words, 5 host sites. So this would typically be a mixture of singles and media walls, and I'm going to assume that you're using all outside help on this. So for example, I'm going to assume 3 singles and 2 media walls for a total of just under $6,900 in equipment, or an average of $1,380 per host site. Some of you may have noticed that the cost per host site actually went up, and the reason is that if we're going to assume outside salespeople are involved, then there's commissions that need to be paid out in setting up the host sites. And I have factored those additional costs into it. So in this example, there's just under $20,600 that's been invested into the 5Z franchise model. We're going to assume that the average monthly ad cost is $110, which averages in the $20 per month for the singles and the $25 per month for the media walls. And with 47 advertisers, that brings the gross revenue to just over $62,000. But in this example, we're assuming that the franchisee has no involvement and they're using outside salespeople 100% of the time, which quite frankly I think is a little unrealistic. But nonetheless, hits the numbers pretty hard, where you end up netting just under $13,600 a year with an ROI of only 66% a year. Now I'm going to take this example in a little different direction. Let's assume in this case that one looked at this more as an investment and then took those net proceeds and reinvested it back into new franchises. That means you would take that $13,600 and you could purchase a 10Z the following year, as in 10 additional host sites, averaging $1,380 worth of cost per each host site. The following year you would be able to purchase 20, and the next year 40, etc., etc., which means at the end of 4 years, based on these projections, the franchisee would have 75 host sites. So the combination of the various formats is endless. As you can see, the numbers are quite attractive, as most businesses and franchises take 4 to 6 years to break even in having your investment returned. Ideally, most of our franchisees would have the opportunity to do that in less than a year. We have provided you with a copy of the spreadsheet, but obviously things are totally dependent on your own success. Again, please note that these projections are meant as an example only, as we cannot guarantee the success or lack of success of any of our franchises.